In March of 1865, Robert E. Lee and his army were extremely desperate. He reached out to General Gordon, a young man who had been wounded 5 times in the Battle of Antietam, and he asked him for options. They need to figure out something fast. Their option eventually would come down to an attack at a place called Fort Stedman. That's where we're headed today, to Fort Stedman. We're going to talk about that battle there and show you what remains. So out here in these woods, there's some real good treats that you can bump into at the Petersburg National Military Park. And one spot out here in particular that we're talking about is right here on the ground. They have a set of rails that you can see there, just a very small section. This was the main rail line, Meade Station, that is, that was supplying the Union Army out here at this battlefield. During the Battle of Fort Stedman, part of the plan was to actually take over this section of works out here and make their way towards this rail. They wanted to affect this supply line eventually. They wanted to stop the supplies coming in and out to this Union Army. Also, the British civilians' account of seeing tin cans around the earthworks after both armies had moved out of the area and seeing the overload of supplies that were left in the trenches for the Union Army versus what was left in the trenches for Confederates, is all because of this station here. City Point was able to take supplies from the river, put them on rails, move them quickly up to their soldiers, and their soldiers stayed well supplied with shoes, clothing, ammunition, and food. Lots and lots of food. Meantime, the Confederate soldiers on the other side there are starting to trickle their way over and desert their army because, quite frankly, they're hungry. They need sustenance, and the army's not supplying it for them, which is one reason why, initially, Fort Stedman's attack worked. So as you walk out here, and you come to the end of the trail, you see this cabin. Now, when this road is opened up, you can actually drive to this parking lot, stop, and go check out the fort and everything that's over here. This sign that's right on the other side here talks about a man from the 50th New York talking about the monotony of living out here between 1864 and 1865. The Pennsylvanians that were in this area only got called to a fight 3 times in that period of time. They were only brought forward from this location, which means the majority of their time they spent primping up their cabins, living a regular life, really, hearing the fight going off in other locations, not really being moved around or messed with, and just getting bored out here with soldier life. Well, one of those 3 times, the Pennsylvanians had to fight towards Fort Stedman because the Confederates were trying to make their way in this direction. And the soldiers from this location actually made their way out there to Fort Stedman to reinforce and support the fight happening over there. I'm going to take you inside this cabin and show you what this exhibit looks like on the inside. Right now, not very good. They have a giant hole in the roof here. You can see up top. That hole is there from years and years of wear and tear in this exhibit, and portions of it yet still look like it's going to fall. You can see it buckling right there under pressure. And they have little wooden slats up in here trying to help the situation out. A lot of mold. But this exhibit kind of represents some of the cabins that would have been out here with the Union soldiers. A little bit of modern stuff on this cabin, some modern looking windows and modern latches and things like that. But from a distance, if you come out of the woods and you see something like this, just imagine rows and rows of little cabins built up like this. This is the reason why the entire area is not really wooded. It's during Fort Stedman, this whole place would have been cleared out. You could see as far as the eyes could see, and it would be earth mound after earth mound of earthworks, and also those little cabins that made up the little city for those Union soldiers. We're going to walk over here towards this recreated earthwork. It's March 1865, and George Pentecost is a soldier with 100th Pennsylvania, back on leave with his family. He's a Middleton boy. He's at a dance, and he receives orders to go back to his unit. He takes those orders in his hands, and he heads out the door. First he stops in Washington, D.C., and then he makes his way back here to Petersburg. George Pentecost, real soon, would end up in a fight that would take his life here in Petersburg, and he would be one of the many, many dead laying out on these fields that would have to be recovered and put in a cemetery. Structures like this one out here at Petersburg really give you a good vantage point of what life would have been like in the trenches. And you see they're protecting themselves from charging enemy on the outside of this fort. And we have all this wood that's inside here that's been built up from them being here for a very long time. The soldiers would have been behind these trenches for a long time, so they have to reinforce and build this small fort, if you will, for cannons to be placed in a strong point like the corners. And again, out front there's more trenches. We'll walk around front so you can see it from the front side, what this earthwork, or many of the earthworks really in Petersburg, would have looked like at the time of the Battle of Fort Stedman. in March of 1865, it would have probably been pretty cold out here, just like it is today. Actually, we're walking around out here right now, and it's snowing a little bit of flurries you might see coming down at this fort. At that time, going back to the beginning of March, the London Times actually had an article in it about March 6th, I believe it was, in 1865, where they were predicting the crumble of Richmond. And they said that Jefferson Davis had said that even with Richmond falling, that they would have been able to keep the fight up for 20 more years in the state of Virginia alone. And that the London Times suspects that Richmond and Virginia was going to have to prove that fact here pretty soon. A lot of people were already thinking that the war was coming to an end or getting close. And even in some of the letters that I've read about the Battle of Fort Stedman, there was talks prior to that they believed that Robert E. Lee was a little bit desperate and that the Confederate Army was falling apart. At the time, there was roughly 57,000 men in the ranks of the Confederate Army. But every single day, more and more Confederate soldiers would come out from behind their trenches and sneak away across to the pickets where the Union soldiers were, with their hands in the air, and surrender to the Union soldiers simply just for food. They were that hungry. Again, the Confederate Army would end up using this against the Union Army when they attacked Fort Stedman, as the forward deployed men who were starting this fight were actually acting like people who were running away from the Army and surrendering to the Union. And then they would attack the men in their forward trench work as they were going into so-called surrender. They would attack them and surprise them. Now, just as promised here, we flip this thing around and we are now on the outside of those recreated trenches here in Petersburg. And you can see this forward area here where soldiers could get down and hunker behind, and then you have the abatis, or the woodwork on the outside to protect the main structure of that fort. And then, of course, the openings where the cannons are placed at strong points or angles in order to attack and fire down the line. It's pretty neat what they did out here. When they first dug this stuff out, I came here shortly after, and all of this was in pretty good shape. They had raised up the dirt molds there, the dirt mounds, pretty high, and all of the woodwork was nice and even, and everything looked real sharp. And this fort has kind of always been here for a while, but it's kind of falling in disrepair right now. So maybe when they get those roads open back up and people can get back out here, we can get some volunteers to do some work out here. So I'm walking on this road today out here because the road on the eastern front is closed completely. So you can't take it down to Stedman or the crater or anything. But nevertheless, we found ourselves a close proximity parking lot, if you will, to make our way out there and back. It's about 3 miles round trip on foot. It's not that big of a deal, especially considering the hike's not bad. It's a little cold out here today, but we'll make our way over there. So what you have out here in this situation is AP Hill. He is on leave, if you will, or furlough, because he's sick. And Robert E. Lee getting pretty desperate here at the end of March of 1865. And he's got to figure out something real quick. So he goes to John B. Gordon, who is his next most trusted young general out here in these trenches. And he gives him the ability to come up with options. It says, provide me with some options, what you think is possible out here on this field. So Gordon comes up with 3 options. First option is that they negotiate peace with General Ulysses S. Grant. The second option is that they abandon the trenches and abandon Richmond and get the heck out of here as fast as they can and meet up with Joe Johnston in North Carolina. And then the third option is that they attack a point in the lines that they determine is weak, and they throw everything at it as fast as they can, hoping to break open the lines, make their way towards that railroad depot we were talking about, and some of the secondary lines that they think are out here, capturing as many soldiers as possible, as many rations as possible, and possibly scaring Grant and his army out of the trenches into another position. Robert E. Lee sends these options off to Jefferson Davis in Richmond. Davis is not having the first 2 options. He knows that if he negotiates peace with Grant, it's not going to come with the caveat that the South is going to continue to be a country. He knows that if they abandon Richmond, that's not what they wanted to do the entire time. Richmond is their government, and for some reason they're hung up on the idea of keeping it. The third option is the only one that Davis will accept. So because of this, Robert E. Lee takes that third option back to Gordon and then says, do something with this. Help us figure out a way to fight these men. And then that's when Gordon realizes, after talking to his officers, that there is a weak point. It's Fort Stedman. It's within 200 yards of Colquitt Salient. It is the weakest point on the line at this particular time. And he's going to hit it in a very different way. Something that we haven't seen in the rest of the trench warfare out here or any other place really. We'll talk more about that when we get over here to Fort Stedman. So I'm about to come up on the area that's got this whole place closed down. This entire road here. It's a little bit of a pothole, sinkhole if you will. Woof. That's looking pretty gnarly. I'm going to flip this camera around so you can see the sinkhole that's shut down this entire park system road. Kind of wondering what they're going to be able to do about this. This looks pretty bad. So when you walk it up on that little guy back there, you're like, what's the big deal? Why do they have this whole park shut down for that thing? And then you get there and you look underneath and you're like, oh my gosh, that was huge. That thing goes all the way up underneath the road there. I can only imagine some poor innocent person comes driving through here and hits that soft spot and then boom, collapses. Their car goes right into it. The front end of it tore all up. It's nasty. It's a good thing they got it shut down. But hopefully they can get it repaired here soon so we can get some people back out in this park again. At least not the people that are on foot, the people that are in cars. Now the position that we're at right now is Harrison's Creek. This is stop number 4 at Petersburg's National Military Park trail system out here. And the reason why we're here is because of James Walker. Those Confederate soldiers that attacked Fort Stedman eventually made their way out to this area, Harrison's Creek, and just a little bit further beyond in that direction. This was the farthest point of their advance. And by the time they got here, over there, the Pennsylvanians, remember we talked about one of 3 times they came out of their trenches to attack. This was the time. When those Pennsylvanians came across that field and started firing cannons and blasting guns over here towards these soldiers, the Confederates were stalled, stopped in their tracks, and had to make their way back towards Fort Stedman and then eventually Colquitt Salient out here. Hartranft's men, the Pennsylvanians, are the people that we're talking about. That attack, because of the stall, was not able to be reinforced. Also, we're going to talk a little bit more about why they weren't reinforced. General Pickett himself being one of the problems. Well, here we are. We are at the infamous Fort Stedman. That little scrabble of land that's out here in the open was Fort Stedman back in 1865. And this is the attack point that's just in front of Colquitt Salient. Now, before the Union Army took this area here, this was actually a part of the Confederate defenses. Long before. We're talking almost 3 years. And then eventually, when the Union Army pushes its way in and takes over portions of the Confederate trenches, they end up creating this thing which was constantly in repair, according to one soldier, and could not be repaired, according to another soldier. Because it was so close to Colquitt Salient, every time they stuck their heads up to try to do some repairs to the outer works of this fort, they were being fired at from Colquitt Salient. And all along the Confederate lines, going down through here, was taking pop shots at this position because it was so close. So you can only imagine what life must have been like for soldiers that were stationed in here, going in and out of this area and heading back in that direction towards the inner works or the safety of their Union lines in the opposite direction. Now, I'm going to walk inside of Fort Stedman, and I'm going to kind of flip this camera around, walk you through the interior of this fort so that you can see the size of the walls. And then we're going to peer out over top of Fort Stedman towards Colquitt Salient, which is where we're going to really start telling the story of the attack as it comes towards Fort Stedman. All right, so we're going to head up inside here, inside of Fort Stedman. Now, they put a paved trail in here to keep people off of the earthworks, which is a pretty good idea. Let's see if I can back this camera out a little bit so you can see better. There we go. So, as you can see, a lot of the defenses are still here. The fort is mostly a big pile of dirt now compared to what it used to be. But the walls are still up. They're still standing even after all these years. And I'm sure there was probably some reinforcement to this stuff years after the battle was over with by locals, turning this into a tourist attraction. But if you look directly off in the distance where that ground rises over there, that's Colquitt Salient. Now I know that doesn't look like a whole lot of distance, but let me give you the first person view and bring this back in. There it is. This is from my viewpoint, what I can see at the top of this fort looking towards Colquitt Salient. The Confederate soldiers are going to be coming out of those trench works over there all along these lines here and pushing their way through this area. This is the center point of the attack. Now, forward deployed out there are Union soldiers and rifle pits and skirmish lines. And those men are out there keeping watch just in case there's an attack inside this fort. When they get to those lines, they are pretending like they are runaways, fugitives from the Confederate Army, and they're surrendering to those Union soldiers. Instead, what they're doing is they're sneaking up on those men and using their sympathy against them, and they are attacking them. If they catch them asleep, they're attacking them. If they catch them awake, it doesn't matter how. They're going in and subduing those men. And eventually, 50 men are going in advance to chop down wooden abattis and anything that's going to be in the way of Confederate soldiers making their way over here to this fort. Then the main lines are going to start coming out and pouring across that field, and then they're going to push off in that direction to Haskell, which is another fort that's over there, and then they're going to make their way through here towards the railroad junction, and then they're going to make their way off in that direction right over there towards another fort, and they're going to continue to push this line, open up the gap, and make their way, hopefully, all the way to City Point so that they can then attack over there. It's a pretty good plan if it goes off correct. And in the very beginning, this fort is taken by the Confederate soldiers fairly quickly. Now, up on a hill is a nice sign that you used to be able to come up here, press this little green button here, and that speaker would pump out some narrative about the fight that happened here at Fort Stedman. It's a good viewpoint of the fort looking from this position on. Plus the picture, if you take a look here, kind of gives you an idea of what this small fort looked like with the trenches extending out from either side towards Fort Haskell and so on. And then these soldiers that are back here that are having to go back and attack towards Fort Stedman and take it back. It's pretty amazing. But the sign doesn't work. So it seems like the roads at Petersburg are not the only thing in disrepair out here and needing help, whether it be funding or volunteer work or otherwise. There's a lot of things out here that really could be worked on, upgraded, and improved so that this national park can continue to tell a very important story of the Battle of Fort Stedman and others here at Petersburg. Now behind me there is the Prince George Courthouse Road historic sign. It's that green and white sign that I have on video that I'm posting up here in this video. This road would have been a road that both of those armies would have used throughout the American Civil War. Both the Union and the Confederate armies traveled up and down this road. This is literally walking in the footsteps of the soldiers. If you want to be able to kind of, I don't know, walk in history, instead of just forts like that over there or going up towards trenches, soldiers would have been on these roads. They would have utilized these roads to make their way from one town to the next, or from one area to the next to build their trenches. So this is kind of a unique perspective to walk on a battlefield on an actual road that they would have walked on. It's kind of mind-blowing for people that love history. If you get out here, park in Fort Stedman's parking lot whenever they finally open the road, and then go to the right-hand side down the hill just a little bit. You'll see that little white and green sign. And then you too can walk out here in the footsteps of these soldiers. Well, that was a pretty good walk out there on the Courthouse Road. Leads out to a parking area that I've never been to before. It's a lot closer to Fort Stedman. So we're going to explore our way over there after we leave this place and see exactly where that is. It's pretty neat. But now I'm heading back up the hill towards one of the monuments that's out here dedicated to the Union soldiers that fought here at the Battle of Fort Stedman on March 25th of 1865. We're going to make our way to Colquitt Salient and talk about the Confederates over there and what they did in order to achieve the success here at Fort Stedman that they had. Just out front here is some of those forward deployed Union lines. The cannons are placed out in advance here as well. Now these are the lines that the Confederates are trying to come to and attack prior to getting up to Fort Stedman itself, which you can see Fort Stedman right over here, off and behind there. These defenses were pretty formidable for these Confederate soldiers. So it's no wonder when they were preparing for attack that they knew that they had to have some kind of surprise in order to take these lines from the Union soldiers, which is why this attack went off at about 4:30 in the morning on March 25th of 1865. I don't know if we can make out the lines in the ground or not, but out here on this field, especially during the wintertime, you can see the depressions in the ground out here from earthworks that were once here, forward deployed of the Union lines. These mounds of dirt are now pretty worn down. They're no longer visible during the summertime, and then during the wintertime when things are dead, you can see those lines, and you can even see Battery 10, for example, is up on this hill, and then you have these lines. The shadows are providing us some really good visuals right now of all of these lines in the earth leading up to Fort Stedman. So now General Gordon talks to Walker, and he asks him for advice also. You know, where can we attack? On your lines, do you see a weak point? And Walker points out the fact that Colquitt salient here is within about 200 yards of that fort, and that those guys aren't even able to reinforce their fort or work on it without being shot at. That the 300 men that are usually stationed inside that fort are laying pretty low. And that's also one of the weak points for the Confederates, because Confederate soldiers are making their way over here and surrendering to the Union soldiers there in that fort, in those fortifications. So with that being what it is, Gordon devises a plan in order to create this sneak attack at about 4:30 in the morning. Now historians have always debated exactly what positions these soldiers were in, or which units fought where out here during this attack. And because it was so late in the war, the reports and everything that came in on this fight aren't as clear as some of the earlier fights in the Civil War. So we can only surmise based on who was attached to who as far as officers are concerned, exactly who fought out here at Fort Stedman. And so we're going to put together kind of a small clip, if you will, of the battle itself as far as the troop movement's concerned. And we're going to talk our way through what happened exactly at this fort, and who went forward first, and which units were involved, and how the attack ended up at the end of this battle here at Fort Stedman. Two partially fortified hills behind Fort Stedman provided some security and support nearly 200 yards to the rear. 9th Corps men occupied the fort, led by Major General John G. Parke, who relieved General Burnside after the Battle of the Crater. The division, led by Wilcox, defended the line from Fort McGilvery to Battery 13. Napoleon Bonaparte McLaughlin defended Fort Stedman with 14th New York Heavy Artillery and Massachusetts men to the north and to the south, with fewer than 2,000 men. John Gordon inspected the Georgians' plans. First, before dawn, select men would unchain the works out front to open a path. 2 pickets would move out and act as deserters to attack the Union pickets. Next, some men would use axes to clear Union works near the fort, approximately 50 of them. The 300 men with unloaded rifles would then use bayonets to capture the fort itself. One issue, Pickett's men didn't have enough rail cars or were slow to get into the fight, and that reduced the force to 10,000 from 18,000. Gordon's division was in place by 4 a.m. Ransom and Laws was to the left of Gordon. There was a single shot fired to signal the attack. The 57th North Carolina led the way, along with other units, to easily capture pickets. 6th North Carolina would be behind the 57th North Carolina with their axes. Union lines were alerted, but couldn't get armed and couldn't make it to the fort in time. With Union troops neutralized in front of the fort, the rest of the army began the attack. Wallace and Ransom took over Battery 10. Terry, Wagaman, and Casey took Batteries 11 and 12. The rest of Gordon's men became stuck outside of the fort. Confederates filed to the right in a low-lying point where hand-to-hand combat broke out. Brigadier General McLaughlin entered the fort when the Southern troops had just taken it. While inside, it was dark, and he began to give orders to Confederate soldiers who were listening to him. But once the sun started to rise and they realized that McLaughlin was a Union soldier, they took him captive. Battery 9 at Fort Haskell started lobbing shells into the fort, and the Confederates widened the gap and fanned out. The 57th and 6th got lost at this time, and there was resistance. And then the attack began to stall. North, Ransom pushes back against the 57th Massachusetts. 2nd Michigan mounted a counterattack, and Ransom fell back. The 20th Michigan, 1st Michigan, the 50th Pennsylvania came to the rescue of Michigan. The 207th and the 209th Pennsylvania sent word to Wilcox for aid, and he promptly sent men. They then pushed back against 4 deployed Confederate soldiers. Ransom then counterattacked, and for a short time he drove the Federals back. With no support, however, Ransom pulled back and dug in. Terry's brigade pressed south, but received heavy resistance. Thinking Fort Haskell was seized by Confederate soldiers, artillery began to fire at the Union troops inside Fort Haskell. Tiny Fort Stedman was now jammed with thousands of Confederate soldiers as Gordon tried to organize in vain and push east. Gordon realized that this was a total failure, and he requested for General Lee to call this off, and Lee then consented. But Federals had already formed an arc around the fort itself, and now Confederates were in there in their own crater. Battery 11 and 12 were recaptured. Then the lines began to tighten. At 7:30, Confederates began to try and make their way back to Colquitt Salient. The Union presses closer as Gordon and his men retreat, but the 49th North Carolina remained isolated because they didn't get word that there was a retreat happening. A brave courier volunteered to take the word to the 49th North Carolina, and he made his way out to them. He then guided them back as they made their way back to Colquitt Salient, but not without massive loss. At 8 a.m., Fort Stedman was recaptured by the United States soldiers, and it was the end of the Battle of Fort Stedman. For 30 minutes, men would lay across this field in various different states, injured, lost, some of them dead. And then finally the call was made for the soldiers to come back out of their trenches and retrieve their men and bury their dead. Now we are out and behind Colquitt Salient. And I don't know if you can see all of this on camera or not, but if you've never been out here before, when you get down behind this hill, it is very, very clear to see that this was a well-used position by the Confederate soldiers out here. Even 150, 160 years later, this place has so many mounds and different, it's almost as if it's the old face of the earth, if you will, the different notches that are in the ground. And it doesn't just pertain to that one location. If you look back off in the woods over here, you can see similar lines down the back of this hill towards the creek that's off behind it, and the railroad that runs directly behind this line as well. This is where these soldiers are living and dying every single day. These Confederates out here, they're living in a nightmare because they can't get out of these trenches, and they are suffering for it. And they're not getting very many supplies in here to feed this army. This is the reason Robert E. Lee's got his back against the wall. Now that we just came off of this little boardwalk here that goes across the creek, and you look up the hill here, I mean, you're really getting a view of some of those earthworks that we were talking about, the Confederate lifeline, the place where these guys were living in mud huts, and every single day dealing with the shells that are being lobbed over here in this position. It was a desperate situation for these soldiers out here. These Confederate soldiers were very aware of their position in life. It's a little bit better of a view from the distance. We're now passing Gracie's salient, named for Brigadier General Archibald Gracie of Alabama. That little sign back there tells you about that, about how he was here and part of this area facing Fort Stedman, and how Alabama defended these works for the entirety of the Siege of Petersburg without losing them. Neat little history like that, that if you're not on foot on the ground out here walking around, you're probably going to miss it. So if you ever come out to Fort Stedman or Petersburg National Park and you park at Fort Stedman, don't just go to the fort. Walk all the way out to Colquitt Salient and make that trip around. Not only is it beautiful out here, but there's history that you're sure to miss if you stay in that parking lot in that tiny little fort. So we're at the front of Colquitt Salient now, and now that we've walk through the battle itself, with that map that we put up on the screen and talked through the different units that are out here. And we've kind of discussed how this battle unfolded. I'm going to flip this camera around and I'm going to walk you from Colquitt Salient in the position of a Confederate soldier headed towards Fort Stedman. Now remember, this is March of 1865. It is 4:30 in the morning. It is pitch black outside. It's cold. You can hear stepping, soldiers' canteens. The Union soldiers in the works over there probably have fires going. You can hear the sounds of people moving around. You can't hear much anything else. And you're going across this field in the dead of night, not able to be seen by the enemy over there unless something shiny flashes off a fire. And if you've ever been on the middle of a battlefield, even during some sort of a reenactment, and it's the middle of the night, and you try to walk around, you know exactly how dark that gets. It's extremely dark out here. Even with the trees gone, it's really dark. So we'll flip this camera around and we'll walk in that direction and kind of talk about it along the way. The cool, frosty morning made every sound distinct and clear, and the only sound heard was the tramp of the men and the cries of the Federal picket as he ran with all speed into fort shouting, "The rebels are coming! The rebels are coming!" Brigadier General James A. Walker, Confederate States Army. So here we are at Colquitt Salient, and there's that marker that we went to earlier that talks about Colquitt Salient and put in the video. Now if I'm a Confederate soldier coming out from behind those trenches, I'm making my way across this field. And as we go across this field, just kind of pay attention to the terrain directly in front of us here as we walk towards Fort Stedman. Now these soldiers come out from behind these trenches, and it's 4:30 in the morning. It's extremely dark, and as they're coming across here, they have to first move their own defense works in front of Colquitt Salient. Then they have to come out through here and find their way towards the forward deployed soldiers of the Union Army, which are positioned out here just in front of where they are. As they're coming out, it's only a small band of soldiers making their way out here. Somewhere between 25 to 50 soldiers are coming out acting as if they are surrendering to the Union soldiers. They make their way right about here, and they end up inside some of the smaller fortifications that are built for Union soldiers who are forward deployed keeping a lookout. Then they subdue those Union soldiers, and they come up this hill and they make their way towards some of the main earthworks and defense lines that are forward of Fort Stedman. You can see Fort Stedman's out here off in the distance. And then there's one of the batteries. Out here are some of the defense works that are forward of the battery. About this time, that's when the 100 men are out here with their axes, and they are chopping away, and they are trying to get through to the battery. They get through to the battery, and they give that signal that they have made their way through, and they clear a path. Then the Confederate soldiers start to pour out from the salient. Now, we've just walked from way back over there. It's really not that far of a walk between us and the first line of defense, where the battery is, and where those lines were that we were talking about off on the left-hand side. Confederates are now pouring through here, and they are making their way up towards the fort. They've subdued Battery 10. They have flipped that battery around, and they're pouring fire into the works over here. Now the men are having to come up on the top of this hill, make their way across this field in the right out open spaces. Now what's so dangerous about this, there's the head of the fort sticking out right there. Cannons are aimed right at you. Rifles can be aimed right at you. You have to face that. But Union soldiers are positioned over here too, and they see what's happening, they hear what's happening, and they're not really sure what to do. Do you fire towards your own men in that fort to try to prevent it from being taken and kill the Confederates that are here? Or do you wait until you get told to do so and hope that it's not what you think it is? Well, eventually, cannons are going to have to fire in this direction and try to hit the Confederate soldiers that have taken this fort. It's a pretty precarious situation. It's a little bit sloshy out here today, so we'll try to keep our feet as dry as we can. Now I'm going to come up over here on the side where they've cleared out the dirt or the grass so that you can get close to the fort and see the lines here. This is a really neat look. And here we are. This is the defense work that's coming off of the fort itself. Right here. This is the main line of defense. And it's going to connect off over the side here. And these batteries are going to also be part of that main line of defense out here. Confederates are pouring over this main line of defense right here. They are pouring into that fort directly right there. They have taken that fort within a short matter of time. John B. Gordon himself is able to put his feet inside of this position. Soldiers are now moving in this direction. Union soldiers are running. There was a description from one letter of a Union soldier that was out here that said as they were sleeping in their tents that men were awakened by soldiers coming in and bayoneting them inside their tents here near Fort Stedman. Imagine that, being asleep, 4 o'clock in the morning, and someone stabs you with a bayonet. Once they get to this side, now the question is what to do. So here we are back at Fort Stedman. There's a sign that's directly out front that talks about the fight that happened here. It was erected by Pennsylvania. This fort would be Lee's last real offensive. It's the last time he tried to go on the offense and attack the Union Army and break up their stronghold here in Petersburg. There would be other fights down the road very shortly in other places like Sailor's Creek and Appomattox, but it was never an offensive. It was a defensive move, something to protect his army, something to keep it alive so that he can break away and possibly meet up with Joe Johnston or get some more supplies for his army. But in here, this was the last time that the Confederate Army really tasted any kind of victory in Virginia. This was it, Fort Stedman. They did win this fort. That army did take this fort. But then it starts to break down. Once they get inside this fort, they're confused. There's an actual officer that's inside this fort with the United States Army that starts giving orders to the Confederate soldiers, and they get confused and they don't know who to listen to. But then they realize that that officer is a Union soldier, and they take him prisoner of war. Off in that distance right over there, right back here, Union soldiers are now being attacked by Confederate soldiers that have poured out of this work and across that field. Those Union soldiers are having to make a decision about firing on their own lines, and they do so. But then another battery off in the distance here realizes over there at that fort that there's Confederate soldiers that could possibly be in there turning the guns. So they accidentally start to fire on that fort, where Union soldiers are actually firing towards this fort to try to take the Confederates out. The Confederates get past this line and go over the other way. They end up off in the distance back here looking for a secondary set of lines that they were supposed to see on a map. They can't find it. They get confused and disoriented. They start breaking up because it's dark and they can't see anything. And they're moving in one direction or the other. The Pennsylvanians come into the fight and they start making their way towards this direction. They hit the Confederates over there at Harrison's Creek. They start pushing them back. And before you know it, the whole line starts to envelop on itself. It comes back this way towards Fort Stedman. They come in here and they fight, eventually getting called back to the lines over there where they are at for a moment in time until they realize that North Carolina is out here by themselves. I believe it's the 46th or the 49th North Carolina is out here and didn't get the word to retreat and fall back. So they have to send people back to help guide that unit back to their defense works. And they get them back over there safely, the majority of them. And that's the end of Fort Stedman. That battle was a success at first, a disaster at the end. And as a result, we're looking on rough numbers, Confederate forces losing almost 2,600 men out here for this fight. The Union soldiers, probably about half that. It is a complete and total victory for the United States Army. And now, Lee is sitting and waiting with no other real options. Eventually, Richmond collapses and the chase to Appomattox begins. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our video out here at Fort Stedman. I've enjoyed the walk. It's about time to head back to the car and get out of this cold. But it's been a wonderful time telling the story. And I hope you enjoy that map that we put up in this video as well. And hope to see you out here on these fields sometime. Be looking out for our link that we're going to put down in the description if you're here for the live premiere to add your email to an email list where we start giving you updates and ask for suggestions and things like that for the channel. It only makes this channel stronger, and it builds our community here at History with Waffles, because we're not just a YouTube channel putting out videos. I think all of us as a collective of private historians telling the stories that we like to hear and digging a little bit deeper than some of those other documentaries would dig. Until next time, this is History with Waffles. Bye.